Joseph Smith is in Nauvoo and he hears these reports of Latter-day Saints who are getting kicked out of their homes and being forced into the city limits of Nauvoo. He hears they're having their weapons stolen from them and he has a gut reaction. He tells his brother Hiram, quote, "We cannot give up our weapons. When we give up our weapons, we give up our liberty," end quote. Meanwhile, news from Warsaw and Carthage and from Missouri and Iowa are telling about angry mobs who are starting to gather their weapons and cannons and prepare to attack Nauvoo. I'm Stephen Detloff, and this is the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast, telling the story of the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. During the persecutions in Missouri, the Missouri militia had come in and taken away the Latter-day Saints' weapons and confiscated them. This was done right before some attacks were made on the Latter-day Saints. Now, 6 years later, Joseph sees his people starting to have their weapons confiscated again, and he starts to have flashbacks to the trials and persecutions in Missouri. Joseph knows that once they start giving up their weapons in an environment where they're surrounded by citizens who are angry with them, that the persecution is going to follow close behind, and that the Latter-day Saints will probably soon start to be attacked, and he doesn't want that to happen. Meanwhile, back at the state capitol, these same reports that Joseph Smith is getting regarding the violence which is starting to come into the county and the mobs that are being organized in neighboring cities, these reports are being received by Governor Ford as well. Some men are getting shot at while they're out with their cattle. Other men are overhearing their mobs plan to murder Joseph Smith. Not only that, but the governor is getting the reports from the incident that started it all. He's hearing about the Nauvoo Expositor having its press destroyed. And the Latter-day Saints are writing affidavits to the governor explaining their persecution and justifying tearing down the press. And the anti-Mormon party and its members are writing affidavits to the governor explaining their persecution, most notably the destruction of the press. And everyone is trying to convince the governor to get on their side and see the conflict from their perspective. And some people with the popular anti-Mormon party in the state, people like Thomas Sharp, editor of the Warsaw Signal, are now getting angry with the governor. The Missouri government adopted anti-Mormon laws and rules, and people are wondering why can't they do it in Illinois? Why is the governor not doing more to fix the problem that they have with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its members? And Governor Ford is worried about a civil war breaking out in Illinois, though. So he decides that he must go to Carthage, the county seat of Hancock County, to see what is going on and try to stop this war from happening. And some of these stories that are getting back to the governor are true, but a lot of them aren't. For example, on the day that Governor Ford gets to Carthage, he was woken up hearing stories about Latter-day Saints going around murdering their enemies and burning down and destroying their houses. And he's told that everyone in the county is heading to Carthage to get up an army to fight the Latter-day Saints. But when he himself gets there, he finds that it was just a story. Someone, somewhere along the line, blew something up out of proportion, or the story could have just been created out of thin air. This happened a lot back during this time period. Stories regularly got blown way out of proportion, so that oftentimes what you get is a strong reaction to an event that didn't even happen, or didn't happen the way that it was told. Now also in the mix, complicating everything, are stories that people intentionally make up so that they have an excuse to quote-unquote defend themselves. And people are saying, I'm only protected by the law and punching someone if I'm punched first, so let's just go ahead and say that I was punched. And then on top of that, people are claiming that the other side is only making up stories so that they can fake a defense. Ultimately, there are enough stories going around and enough tension in the air that the governor feels he has to go to Carthage, so he does. He gets there on June 21st and sets up shop in the hotel there, the Hamilton House. Meanwhile, back in Nauvoo, stories keep coming in. More affidavits are being made and the persecution is increasing, and Joseph decides he must do something about it. So, acting as mayor, he writes a declaration of martial law. His declaration says, quote, "From the newspapers around us and the current reports brought in from the surrounding country, I have good reason to fear that a mob is organizing to come upon this city and plunder and destroy said city, as well as murder the citizens. And by virtue of the authority vested in me as mayor, and to preserve the said city, declare the city under martial law," end quote. And so the city is now under the order of the Nauvoo Legion, and more specifically under the order of the leader of the Nauvoo Legion. It's Lieutenant General Joseph Smith. And as mayor, Joseph writes the declaration of martial law. Then literally 15 minutes later, turning from mayor to lieutenant general, Joseph goes to address his troops at the parade grounds. And when he addresses them, he is dressed in full military gear. He has the hat with the big plume and the blue jacket with the yellow shoulder wings, and he has a sword sheathed at his side. Part of Joseph's outfit, by the way, can be found in Salt Lake City at the LDS Church History Museum. And now the parade grounds are right next to Joseph's house, the Nauvoo mansion. And right across the street from Joseph's house is the timber frame of a building under construction. So they had put a little platform on top of this building, and Joseph climbs up on top of it and this frame, and he addresses the more than 2,000 troops that have gathered for their orders. Regarding the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor, Joseph says, quote, "We have broken no law," end quote. He tells the troops gathered that he and his fellow defendants were acquitted in the first trial regarding the destruction of the expositor press, that they were discharged from the second trial, and he tells the men gathered that the, quote, "mob men, priests, thieves, and bogus makers, apostates, and adulterers who combined to destroy this people now raise the hue and cry throughout the state that we resist the law, in order to raise a pretext for calling together thousands more of infuriated mob men to murder, destroy, plunder, and ravish the innocent," end quote. And he asked the men, quote, "Will you all stand by me to the death, and sustain at the peril of your lives the laws of your country, and the liberties and privileges which our fathers have transmitted unto us, sealed with their sacred blood," end quote. And the thousands in attendance all shout aye, or yes. And after they told him yes, he said, quote, "It is well. If you had not done it, I would have gone out there," end quote. And he points out to the west and says, quote, "If you had not done it, I would have gone out there and would have raised up a mightier people," end quote. And I especially like that line, "If you had not done it, I would have gone out there and raised up a mightier people." That highlights to me the very Old Testament prophet mentality of Joseph. He's there to do what he is going to do, and everyone can either get on board or get out of the way. Anyway, Joseph continues his speech on top of the wooden platform on the timber building frame. He says, quote, "Come all ye lovers of liberty, break the oppressor's rod, loose the iron grasp of mobocracy, and bring to condign punishment all those who trample under the foot the glorious Constitution and people's rights," end quote. Then Joseph draws his sword, he unsheaths it, and he raises it to the sky. He says, quote, "I call God and angels to witness that I have unsheathed my sword with a firm and unalterable determination that this people shall have their legal rights, and be protected from mob violence, or my blood shall be spilt upon the ground like water, and my body consigned to the silent tomb. While I live, I will never tamely submit to the dominion of cursed mobocracy. I would welcome death rather than submit to this oppression, and it would be sweet, oh sweet, to rest in the grave rather than submit to this oppression, agitation, annoyance, confusion, and alarm upon alarm any longer," end quote. He goes on, he says, quote, "I do not regard my own life. I am ready to be offered a sacrifice for this people, for what can our enemies do? Only kill the body, and their power is then at an end. Stand firm, my friends, never flinch. God has tried you. You are a good people. Therefore I love you with all my heart. Greater love hath no man than that he should lay down his life for his friends. You have stood by me in the hour of trouble, and I am willing to sacrifice my life for your preservation. May the Lord God of Israel bless you forever and ever. I say it in the name of Jesus of Nazareth and in authority of the holy priesthood which he hath conferred upon me," end quote. And everyone in attendance says amen to Joseph's statements, and then they commence going around the city, setting up barricades at all the entrances and going on patrols and ensuring the safety of the city as it's in martial law. And they have an armory that they have constructed, and they're pouring balls to fire out their muskets. And while they're doing this, as Lieutenant General, Joseph goes down to inspect, and he tells the men, quote, "There will not be a gun fired on our part during the fuss, but we must be ready nonetheless," end quote. So Joseph, being worried about mob activity, has declared martial law. And the governor, worried about mob activity and Latter-day Saint activity, has set up shop in Carthage, and he's hearing perspectives from both sides of the contention. The governor is interviewing people and collecting all their stories, and a lot of the leading anti-Mormons and enemies of the church go out and visit to tell the governor their side of the story. William Law doesn't go, he's still in Iowa, but William's business associates go, his brothers go. Or his brother goes. Members of Thomas Sharp's anti-Mormon commission are there. Other men who are vagabonds and adventurers who have been swept up in this story and are fighting against Joseph Smith are also there too. They all go out to Carthage and give their views on the matter to the governor. And Joseph Smith sends all these affidavits that he's collected to the governor too. And he sends one of his close friends and a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and actually the campaign manager for his presidential election, John Taylor, out to visit the governor with these affidavits. Because, remember, Joseph is still running as the third-party candidate for president while all this is going on. John Taylor goes with another Latter-day Saint, Dr. Bernheisel. They're sent to tell Governor Ford that Joseph Smith cannot go to Carthage for trial, that it's too dangerous, and that if a third trial is going to take place, it must take place in Nauvoo. And this request isn't too out of the ordinary. In Missouri, when Joseph Smith was in Liberty Jail for treason, he went to court twice in old abandoned farmhouses because the state didn't think it was safe enough to march him through mobs to an actual courthouse. So John Taylor and Dr. Bernheisel traveled to Carthage, Illinois. Carthage is 20 miles southeast of Nauvoo, and they stay that night at the Hamilton Hotel, which, again, is the main hotel in the city. And so everyone is staying there. Governor Ford is there. Leaders of the anti-Mormon movement are there. William Law's brother Wilson, Francis Higbee. It's like the social center of the city. And it's where everyone has to return and go to sleep tonight after they've been arguing with each other during the day. And they spend the night at the hotel, and while they're there, John Taylor becomes worried that they're trying to be murdered by some of their enemies that are staying in the hotel as well. And so he sleeps all night long with 2 loaded pistols underneath his pillow. And in the morning, he and Dr. Bernheisel meet with Governor Ford. And while they're meeting with Governor Ford, these enemies of Joseph Smith are also in the meeting. And they're reading over the governor's shoulders the affidavits the Latter-day Saints have written, and they're telling the governor, oh, that's a lie, and that's a lie too. And they're directing him and trying to coach him on how to view and how to think about the evidence provided by the Latter-day Saints, supporting Joseph's inability to travel to Carthage. Now, years later, when ex-Governor Ford is writing the history of Illinois, covering the years that he served as governor, he said regarding these affidavits and reports of all the troubles between the Latter-day Saints and their enemies, quote, upon the whole, if one half of these reports had been true, the Mormon community must have been the most intolerable collection of rogues ever assembled. Or, if one half of them were false, they were the most maligned and abused, end quote. Now, that seems like a partial statement, but the governor wasn't necessarily partial to the Latter-day Saints. Governor Ford only served 1 term as governor, and he actually died just 6 years after Joseph Smith. And on his own deathbed, the governor still claimed that Joseph was an impostor and that his followers were ignorant. He, however, as opposed to Thomas Sharp and William Law, believed that most of the problems of the Latter-day Saints were political. And we talked about this in the first episode, but you'll remember that the Latter-day Saints were such a powerful voting bloc that they controlled who won elections and who did not. And so Governor Ford believed that the persecution and murder of the prophet was performed by people who wished to have a more fair system of democracy and wished to destroy the leader of this voting bloc in Hancock County. And so in Carthage in 1844, the governor sides with the majority of the people in his state and tells John Taylor and Dr. Bernheisel that Joseph needs to go to Carthage for trial. And still they insist that he cannot. Well, the governor tells them that the citizens of Illinois want to see Joseph brought to Carthage so that he can undergo a fair trial for the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor. And again, John Taylor tells them no, that the citizens of Illinois only want Joseph brought to Carthage so that they can kill him on the way there, or kill him once he gets to the city. Well, then the governor flips it on John. He says, you think your neighbors want to kill you? Well, you think very poorly of them. And they can tell that you think very poorly of them too. And the governor essentially ends up saying that if you want people to like you better, you need to start doing what they want you to do. Because if you resist public opinion, the public is just going to hate you more and more. The governor then tells the 2 men that he will personally see that Joseph is protected on the way to Carthage, and he has them go outside and wait as he writes a letter for them to take to Joseph. John Taylor and Dr. Bernheisel get this letter from the governor, and they go back that night, back to Nauvoo. And while Joseph is waiting for Taylor and Bernheisel, he's walking down by the Mississippi River with his bodyguard, Stephen Markham. And the prophet tells Stephen that he knows he is going to die. And he wants his brother Hiram to avenge his death, but Joseph doesn't feel like that will happen, because Hiram refuses to leave Joseph's side long enough so that Joseph can be killed without Hiram there protecting him. In fact, on the banks of the Mississippi River, Joseph tells Stephen that if he and Hiram are ever taken again, that they will both be murdered, or he is not a prophet of God. So John Taylor and Dr. Bernheisel arrive in Nauvoo and give Joseph the governor's letter. And they go upstairs to Joseph's office in his house, and they read through it with Joseph and other close friends and advisors. The governor writes that even though the Nauvoo expositor was full of libels, that Joseph and the city council did not have the right to destroy it. The governor says that he himself was at a near constant attack from a newspaper in Illinois, but he does not destroy it. And in fact, the governor says that he would shed blood to defend their right to attack him. Governor Ford over and over again tells Joseph how much he values the freedom of the press. He tells Joseph that he and all other men involved in the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor press must submit themselves for arrest. Governor Ford says, quote, "I am anxious to preserve the peace. A small indiscretion may bring on a war. The whole country is now up in arms, and a vast number of people are ready to take the matter into their own hands. And such is the excitement of the country that I fear the militia, when assembled, would be beyond legal control." End quote. The governor here fears what happened back in Missouri. In Missouri, when the militia was assembled to protect the Latter-day Saints from being attacked by mobs, the militia showed up and began defecting to the side of the mob. The militia itself was so full of people angry with the Latter-day Saints that they refused to obey the orders of their commanders. So instead of showing up to fight the enemy, they joined the enemy. The generals of the Missouri militia ended up having to march the militia out of the area because their men were just showing up and defecting to the enemy. And so this is a valid fear that Governor Ford has, that the militia is soon to be beyond legal control. It had happened before in a neighboring state, and I think this is a fascinating look into the society that they lived in, that this order and organization and societal rules were there, but they were kind of tenuous. And there was always this underlying current of anarchy or mob rule or populism that was threatening to undermine the authority of government. The governor ends his letter to Joseph by saying that he will promise the protection of all the people that leave Nauvoo and travel to Carthage to face trial. Well, at the end of the letter, Joseph looks up and says, quote, "There's no mercy here," end quote. And Hiram agrees and tells Joseph that, quote, "As sure as we fall into their hands, we are dead men," end quote. And while Joseph is upstairs in his office, a steamboat pulls into town. And you can imagine this steamboat pulling into town when there's martial law in the streets. The Nauvoo expositor press has been destroyed. The governor of the state is in a hotel room 20 miles southeast trying to prevent a civil war, and this steamboat pulls into town. And there are 2 men on board who persuade the steamboat captain to stop so they can go visit with Joseph Smith, the famous prophet. Now, aside from the timing of the visit, this is a pretty normal routine for the prophet. Travelers were always coming out to Nauvoo to visit Joseph Smith. He's the young leader of a growing religion, a prophet, a translator, a stranger, and a pilgrim on the earth. People are interested in him. Governors, travelers, newspapermen are all regularly streaming into Nauvoo to visit this fascinating religious leader. But who shows up tonight but 2 of the sons of the Secretary of State for the United States, John C. Calhoun, Jr. Now, you'll remember that 2 episodes ago, we talked about how Joseph was writing letters back and forth with the Secretary of State, and these letters were being published in newspapers all across the country. And in them, Joseph was trying to get Secretary of State Calhoun to commit some sort of federal assistance or aid to his people, but he wouldn't. And here his 2 sons come in, both in their early 20s, knocking on the door. Now, they weren't there in Nauvoo to talk about the Latter-day Saint problem per se. They didn't specifically come out west to visit Joseph. They were traveling through on their way further out west and just decided they had to stop by and see the prophet. And so they get to the Nauvoo house, and there are 300 armed men outside. And they ask a man guarding the front gate, Reynolds Calhoun, if they cannot come up and meet the prophet, and he tells them no. Reynolds had been meeting upstairs with the prophet, going over Governor Ford's letter to him, but he was sent down earlier specifically to watch the gate. And the city marshal, too, comes down and tells the Calhoun boys that they need to leave. And everyone assumes they're spies from the anti-Mormons or from William Law, because remember, spies are everywhere. Finally, though, the Calhoun boys are insistent enough that they get an interview with Joseph. And Joseph goes downstairs into the drawing room and talks to them. And maybe he thinks that this might be the perfect time to appeal to the federal government again. Or maybe he thinks that they're in relation to Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt, who are out in Washington, D.C., trying to find support for their cause. And either way, Joseph meets with the young Calhouns for so long, and John Taylor is so tired from his long day in Carthage that he goes home to get some sleep. And not much comes from the meeting, and the Calhouns end up telling Joseph that he should keep seeking for federal assistance, and Joseph probably decides that was a good idea, because he goes back upstairs and writes a response letter to Governor Ford, telling them that he is going to, based off advice from men back east, continue to appeal to the federal government for assistance. So back upstairs in the office, after writing this response letter to the governor, Joseph asks his brother, Hiram, quote, "What shall we do?" end quote. And Hiram says, "I don't know." And then suddenly Joseph perks up. He has a thought. He says, quote, "The way is open. It is clear to my mind what to do. All they want is Hiram and myself. Then tell everybody to go about their business and not to collect in groups, but to scatter about. There is no doubt they will come here and search for us. Let them search. They will not harm you in person or property, not even a hair of your head. We will cross the river tonight." End quote. And Joseph goes downstairs. He gets Emma, his wife, and he gets up his children. He tells them all goodbye. Now, Joseph's wife, Emma, at the time had 4 children and was pregnant with a 5th. She had married Joseph back in 1827. This is 3 years before he founded the Restored Church of Jesus Christ. And essentially her whole marriage had been varying degrees of this, on the run from mobs and apostates. And she must have been at the very least as exhausted as Joseph was of running. Now, 6 years earlier, Joseph was forced to run out of Kirtland, Ohio, in the night on horseback, running away from men who were looking to kill him. And Emma was pregnant at that time with her 4th child. She had stayed back in the city. She'd packed a wagon with a few things and put her 3 children inside and left everything else to follow Joseph out of town the very next day. Emma had met up with Joseph and a few of his closest followers 60 miles outside of Kirtland, and they made the 800-mile trek together to Missouri. And armed mobs followed them for the first 200 of those miles. Brigham Young was one of the men on the run with Joseph Smith from those mobs, chasing them out of Ohio. And Brigham Young was the leader of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He had also been forced to leave Kirtland, Ohio. However, he was forced out a month before Joseph was forced out. He was threatened to be killed by a large group of men who had left the church and started their own Reformation movement, just as William Law was to do 6 years later. And the leader of the new Reformation church in Kirtland was going to be a man named David Whitmer. The apostates within the religion held a meeting in the Kirtland Temple, the center point of the Latter-day Saint settlement in Ohio, and they began talking about how Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. Now, remembering this meeting later, Brigham Young said that he stood up and told them all, quote, "Joseph was a prophet, and I knew it, and that they might rail and slander him as much as they pleased. They could not destroy the appointment of the prophet of God. They could only destroy their own authority, cut the thread that bound them to the prophet and to God, and sink themselves to hell." End quote. And with this statement, Brigham Young found himself being chased out of Kirtland by the men forming this new Reformation church. And so we talked about back in episode 2 how William Law was hoping to be excommunicated at one of the church's biannual conferences called the General Conference. Well, those still go on in the church, general conferences. And in fact, at the October 2017 General Conference, one of the leaders of the church today told this story about Brigham Young standing up to the leaders of this Reformation movement. And he told this story, and then he said to those members of the church listening, quote, "There will be times, as there were in the days of Kirtland, when we will need the faith and the integrity of a Brigham Young to stand in the place the Lord has called us to, loyal to his prophet and to the leaders he has put in place." End quote. And so even today, these stories are told and shared, and morals are pulled out from them, and calls are made from them to follow God's prophet on the earth. As Joseph and Brigham ran away from Kirtland with their families, they were forced to hide underneath blankets and wagons as they rode through the countryside. And the mobs burst into the places they were staying and the places they were eating at on the roadside, trying to find the family. And one time, actually, the mob burst into the sleeping family's room, but miraculously didn't recognize the prophet or his travel companions. So the Smiths flee Ohio and get to Missouri. And only a few months after arriving in Missouri, the Latter-day Saints are attacked. And Joseph is taken off to jail as his oldest son, Joseph Smith III, is clinging to his leg. A guard hits the young kid with the side of his sword and tells him that he isn't going to see his dad ever again. Emma's husband has been thrown in jail, as Emma stands by and helplessly watches. This is less than a year after getting to Missouri. Emma leaves the state with her children in a wagon, leaving behind all of her property again. Heading back east, Emma crossed the frozen Mississippi River into Illinois, carrying her 2.5-year-old son Frederick and her 8-month-old son Alexander, while her other 2 children were with the wagon. Remembering that Exodus, Emma said, quote, "The reflection is more than human nature ought to bear," end quote. Now, settled into Nauvoo, Emma is pregnant with their 5th child, who is due to be born in November. That's 5 months from now. And Joseph comes downstairs after reading this letter from Governor Ford telling him he must go to Carthage, and once again, in the middle of the night, Joseph tells his wife he has to leave. And all the while, Emma has seen what happened with the Nauvoo expositor. She's seen the trials, and then seen the Nauvoo Legion in the street patrolling for mobs, which are now starting to grow in the neighboring cities. And Joseph and Emma hug each other and tell one another goodbye. Joseph is crying. He leaves the house with a handkerchief covering his face out into the night, out past the 300 armed guards who are standing watch around his house. It's well past midnight now. Joseph and his brother Hiram and Porter Rockwell and Willard Richards have set out into the dark. And in the very first episode, we talked about Joseph's love for Porter, where he referred to Porter as, quote, a fellow wanderer with myself, an exile from his home, end quote. And so it is again. Joseph and Porter are exiles from their homes. This reminds me of what Jesus said of himself. He said, quote, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head, end quote. I think in a small way, Joseph and Emma and Porter Rockwell are in a similar circumstance. They occasionally are obligated to leave with no place to lay their heads. And the title of this podcast, Strangers and Pilgrims, comes from the Bible, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. In the book, the author talks about the Old Testament prophets like Moses and Abraham, who through faith performed many great works, but were wanderers on the earth. They were mocked and scourged and put into bonds and prisons, and they were stoned, and sawn asunder, and wandered in deserts and mountains. I look at Joseph Smith and these early converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Porter Rockwell and Brigham Young and Emma and Hiram. I look at them as strangers and pilgrims in the world. They were trying to live their religion, trying to implement revelations from God, and for that they were punished and fought against. And in choosing to tell the story of the death of Joseph Smith through the framework of Strangers and Pilgrims, I've chosen to highlight and revisit Joseph's fleeing from Kirtland and from Missouri, and his hiding from false accusations and murder attempts. There are definitely numerous ways to tell the story of the death of Joseph Smith, and different aspects of it you could highlight and different themes to pull out, but I've chosen to take the perspective that highlights him as a stranger and a pilgrim. So once again, Joseph, Hiram, Porter, and Willard Richards have set out, and they head out and get to a small boat that's tied up in the Mississippi. And they all get in, and it has one oar and Porter paddles. And the boat they've taken is full of holes. And Joseph, Hiram, and Willard take off their boots and have to bail the boat out as Porter paddles them along. And they cross the giant Mississippi River in the dark by moonlight, and they're officially on the run. They paddle from the night of June the 22nd into the morning of June the 23rd, and Joseph Smith will be murdered in 4 days. On the next episode of the podcast, the citizens of Nauvoo and Governor Ford's men make moves to ensure their successes after they learn Joseph Smith left Nauvoo in the middle of the night. Scripts of each podcast episode can be found at our website, www.pilgrimspodcast.com. Music for this episode is from the song Carthage Waltz. It was written and recorded by Michael Hinckley, and the dialogue was written and recorded by myself, Stephen Detloff.